All right, folks. We are live on Facebook. Good afternoon. Rob Smith over at Marquette University, Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach. Adam, what's going on, man?
Hey, happy to be here.
Well, we are in our second conversation this month about voting rights. And today we really want to have an opportunity to talk about the importance of young people in that process, our college students, and even high school students in some respects. You know, the longstanding campaign for voter equality has been multi-generational indeed. And so we want to make sure to highlight some of those themes today. We've got some pretty awesome folks with us, and we're going to allow them to introduce themselves. I want to make sure to highlight this image here from Freedom Summer, 1964, where college students walked into the belly of the beast, went down the Mississippi to help register African Americans across the state and in some of the most rural parts of the state, and at the same time did a wonderful job in encouraging and being a part of some of the groundswell of activism that would come out of Mississippi around voting rights. And so, as we oftentimes do, we like to use images to tell some stories. Want to keep going, Keisha? We got our same folks in Command Central. Keisha and Ben are keeping us on schedule. We're on Facebook as well. Let's give our attendees an opportunity to introduce themselves, Adam.
Absolutely. So, you all will do a bet. How about this? We'll give each of you about 20, 30 seconds to just tell us who you are. And let's start. I'll go down. Raisha isn't able to join us today. I'll go down the list here. Peter, would you mind introducing yourself first?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Peter Burris. Thank you, Rob and Adam, for having me. I am the Wisconsin campaign manager with All Voting is Local, which is a nonpartisan voting rights project housed at the Leadership Conference Education Fund and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
And Peter really is a co-conspirator today. Peter did a great job helping to make sure we get the right voices on this conversation today. And it's a great opportunity for us to partner with All Voting is Local and the other folks here on the call today, because we know how important the work is you do around voting rights. So thanks, Peter. We appreciate you, man.
Kristen.
Hi, everyone. Kristen Hansen with the Campus Vote Project. I am the Wisconsin State Coordinator. The Campus Vote Project is a program of the Fair Elections Center out of Washington, D.C. The Fair Elections Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public interest law firm that focuses on cases around voting rights. And the Campus Vote Project has people like me on the ground in the states in about, I think, 10 or 11 states now. And we work with campuses across the country. I think we're over 275 campuses now that we work with. Excited to be here.
Cool. Yeah.
All right.
Looking forward to working with you as well, Kristen. This is going to be not only an important time, but a fun time to really be a part of these conversations. It's great.
It is.
And Brianna, do you prefer Bree?
Bree is fine. Yeah.
All right. So Bree.
So I'm Bree, student at Marquette University, going into my senior year studying political science. I'm an Andrew Gimmin Foundation campus ambassador. I'm also an intern with Curdo, research intern with Curdo Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach.
All right. Well, we are excited to have all of you here, and that's kind of the basics of your background. Let's move to the next slide. As a way of getting the conversation started, this is a history series, so we want to ask a question that's a little bit reflective, just as a warm-up, to discuss the significance of the passing of John Lewis on the current generation and the message sent through his funeral services. When we established the idea of doing this series in August, little did we know it would be kind of within the frame of a really consequential moment for discussions around voting rights. We knew it would be important, but it was fortuitous how relevant it's become over the past few weeks. So can you guys talk a little bit about your interpretation of the significance of John Lewis, his legacy, and how you feel that fuses into work that's yet to be done?
And as you all gather your thoughts, we want to make sure that our attendees jump in with the chat. You all know how we do this. We want to hear from you. We want to engage with you. What's up, Kristen, over at Wisconsin Historical Society, and Heather, one of our awesome educators who works with us. We appreciate you all joining us, Nate, Lisa, and everybody else. We're a bunch of repeaters over here, so thank you for joining us. And I'm just filling some time so that our panelists get a chance to gather their thoughts. I'm just rambling a little bit. Who's ready? Who wants to jump in?
I can start.
Let's talk about John Lewis, Kristen.
Let's talk about John Lewis. Don't tell my boss, but I could not tear myself away from the funeral. I watched like the entire 4 hours of it on a workday. Oops.
That's the job responsibility.
Yeah.
I think the thread that seemed to be, to me, running through all of the speakers at his funeral was the fact that while he got himself into a lot of necessary good trouble, which I think is a wonderful thing to use that phrase, he always had a strategy. They were constantly talking about his grace, his intelligence, and the fact that he knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. It wasn't just rabble-rousing for the sake of rabble-rousing. He had a plan. And I think that is something that people can really take from his work. I also think that his life in general, I hope, will be studied in history classes for decades to come. He lived a very long life and really, he was working on voting rights for over 60 years. There's a lot there. And that in and of itself should be part of an entire history curriculum. And I'm looking forward to that happening. But yeah, I think people should really study what he did and the strategies he used and the fact that he brought so many people together to affect those strategies. The other thing that they talked a lot about was that even though he was elected to Congress and of course reelected so many times, he never forgot his district and where he came from. The reason he got reelected so many times is that he consistently paid attention to what the people of his district really wanted from him and was back there all the time listening to them. Any elected official or someone who wants to go into electoral politics should remember that. Many times people get elected to Congress and forget where they came from, and he never did.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Who's up next? Who wants to go next?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said, and I think it is important to study the history of John Lewis and other I would say freedom fighters during that time fighting for voting rights, because without it we kind of get lost, like the younger generation, and people kind of forget what voting means, or who came before us. And I think it's also important because a lot of times we try to reinvent the wheel instead of going back and looking at what they did during that time. So when you said study the history and learn more on about John Lewis and what he did in his tenure, I think it is important, because a lot of times we're always trying to figure out how do we get people to care, how do we get people to understand that their vote matters. But if they done it and they passed the whole Civil Rights Act based off showing people that their vote matters. So I think that it is super important to go back and relearn the history of John Lewis and others who was in the fight with him.
Well, Bree, it's also a fascinating history. Not only is it important civic education, but it's just a remarkable story, in terms of folks' experiences in the South and grappling with Jim Crow, and then the importance of historically Black colleges and universities. It's just, there's so many threads to his life that is instructive in so many ways. Peter, what you got? Kind of thoughts you would like to share with us?
Oh, too much to add. I think, you talked about this a little bit last week. There's just no separating John Lewis from the fight for voting rights, and voting rights in the way that they're foundational to our civil and human rights. And I think, as you saw with the memorial and so much of the coverage around his passing, it's clear how many young people are impacted by his story, and how he's really the entry point into understanding and fighting for voting rights for so many people, and myself included. I didn't really start thinking about the importance of voting rights until undergrad, when I took a trip with a group of students to the Edmund Pettus Bridge to learn about his work, and to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. And if anybody has, if you haven't been to that museum and have the chance, it's just about the most incredible museum, which John Lewis had a heavy hand in building, and is a very clear presence. And I'll never forget the end of that museum. There's a big video with people marching for different areas of justice. And I stepped into the room halfway through, started the video again once it began, and a woman came and sat down next to me, and video ended, felt her take a deep breath, and she said, "Isn't that just about the most powerful thing you've ever seen?" The way that this video captures young people, and the power that young people have to impact democracy in the United States and in the world. And so, I think he's just such a clear representative of the power of young people, and in particular young Black people, and one of the main reasons that folks are fighting so hard to suppress the power of young people, and in particular young Black people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for those very insightful and warm comments, because I think it is important for us on an ongoing basis to not only come back to John Lewis, but C.T. Vivian and some of the other folks we've lost this year. And as we as we face abrasive racism and fascism coming from D.C., it's ever more important. And that's the umbrella, of course, that all this sits in, alongside or including a pandemic. And Peter, the museum is remarkable, because it's not only a remarkable gathering of the story of civil rights in the U.S. It's global in its approach, and to connect these struggles and these issues here in the U.S. to other struggles across the globe is really critical. The last thing I'll add, I know we got to get into some of our other themes, is because we're thinking about these conversations for the classroom. John Lewis also represents an important thread that we often use the language from protest to politics. What happens after the protest moment? What do you do once you've demonstrated, you've boycotted, you've raised a certain amount of social awareness to an issue. There has been legislative change or some sort of policy change. Then what happens? And as we know, in some ways that is an even more challenging uphill battle. That's a different fight, obviously, but it's still significantly challenging, because you have to move institutions and move politics and move people in ways that are it's a heavy lift. And so from protest to politics.
If I would that's something that we've been talking about through the story of the open housing marches, of the Chapman Hall takeover, some local history, which is sometimes the fearlessness of youth. How it can connect to the ideas of making institutional, systemic, sustained change, and John Lewis's life is a blueprint for that. Within the different seasons of his life, he's kind of a one-man version of how youthful exuberance and righteousness can turn into a career of creating change within the system you came out to protest in the first place. So with that, maybe this is a conversation focusing on the power of and the challenges of students voting. Keisha, can we move to the next slide?